This is Launching Your Daughter podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Now, here is today's episode. Episode 25. I'm so excited for this episode today because I'm having a conversation with a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Melvin Varghese, and I'm so honored to have him on this show because we get to discuss what perfectionism looks like from a male perspective. I know in the past episodes, I've definitely talked with other clinicians and therapists regarding what that may look like as a mother, as a woman, and how that affects teen girls. And today I wanted to share it from a guy's perspective. The purpose of this, or one of the goals of this, is just to continue to raise awareness that perfectionism truly does impact both genders. And the more we give ourselves permission to explore who we are, embrace those imperfections, it really does role model to our teenagers and adolescents out there in the world, whether you are a parent, you're a mentor, you're a teacher, however you touch and impact teenagers' worlds, showing this and role modeling to them that we all are imperfect is extremely important. So I hope you enjoy today's interview with Dr. Varghese and that you can help raise that awareness more for the teenagers that you work with. Now here is today's episode. So welcome everybody. Today, my guest is Dr. Melvin Varghese, a psychologist in Philadelphia, PA, and the host of the popular podcast, Selling the Couch. He is a colleague and a mentor of mine in the podcasting journey. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with him today because we're going to be talking about perfectionism and how it can impact relationships, but it's going to be from a male perspective. So welcome, Melvin.
Nicole, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This is definitely a tough topic to talk about, but I look forward to, talking about it and having an honest conversation because I do feel like many of us struggle with it, especially a lot of men struggle with it.
Yeah. And, you and I were talking earlier and I said, I just don't think we talk enough about it from a man's perspective. There's still very much a societal view that men need to, kind of be the robot in life and be the strong one and not really show emotions, or you've got to constantly achieve. And if you don't, then you failed. And so we've talked in past episodes about what that looks like from maybe a teen girl's perspective or a woman's perspective. Now I want to have that dialogue regarding kind of the male's perspective, and you've hit it. It truly does affect both genders, and it is a tough topic to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this, right before we got on, and I think especially it's a tough topic for regardless of what, gender-wise. But I think for men, it's particularly hard because there are, in some ways, I think because, especially if you live in the US and you live in a society where things like hard work, all these things are emphasized, right? Sometimes, especially for men, I think we can wear perfectionism like a badge of honor in the workplace.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think it's a struggle, I think, for men because in some ways it's a confusing message, right? On one hand, many of us struggle internally with perfectionism. But on the other hand, society is telling us that perfectionism is something we should strive for.
Correct. Yeah. And I'm laughing because it's like that. You've hit it. It's, we've got to be perfect in everything. And it's, no, we're not perfect. We're human beings. And so we can't ever attain being perfect. So it's very tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's the other side of that is, at least for me, is like when I can hold this truth that when we embrace our imperfectionism, is when other people see our own humanity, right?
Yes.
And that's such a hard concept for me to grasp. But every time I've been vulnerable or shown that I don't have it all put together, right? Mm-hmm. Where I have feared that people would reject me, in the overwhelming majority of cases, it's been that people have understood or they have accepted me as I am.
Yeah. And I think this is one quality that I, truly admire about you, is that you do step into that vulnerability, and you're such a role model to, again, from the podcasting that you do to other healthcare professionals, and putting that out there, because this is also just saying for all adults out there, it's okay to role model that imperfection and to step into that. And you've hit it, that when we give ourselves permission to feel the vulnerability, the so-called, negative emotions, the scared, the fears, the whatever, that it also allows us then to be more present with the positive emotions. And again, really, emotions aren't good or bad. They're just, they're emotions. But we're allowed to then step into that and go, wow, this doesn't define me or my self-worth. This is just a growth edge. And I accept me as where I am. And you hit it, that more often than not, the feedback you will get from those that are trusted people or that know you will support you in that. And it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and I love the way that you're talking about it. Like it truly is a growth edge once we can see it that way, right? That when perfectionism and those things come up, it doesn't have to be something we just act on, without thinking about it. That, that we can take a step back and see, who do we want to be in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of stepping back, I want us, if we could kind of travel back in time just a little bit. And if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit, like as a teenager, as a male teenager, how do you think, or did it even show up at that time, kind of perfectionism show up for you during that stage?
Oh, it definitely showed up. So, I guess to answer your question, I think it's helpful to have some background. So, I'm originally from India. I was born and raised there until I finished the first grade, and then my parents said that, hey, we're gonna immigrate to the U.S. And
Wow.
so, and I'm the oldest, so I have a younger brother, and so my dad was working in India. My mom was actually a nurse in Saudi Arabia. So part of why she went
Wow.
to Saudi Arabia was because just to have a better like economic opportunity
Mm-hmm.
and better, more comfortable life for us
Uh-huh.
growing up in India. But so I think part of a decision for my parents was, so that they could be reunited, and that we could move to the US and that we could have better educational opportunities. So second grade, I moved to the United States, speaking very little English. I mean,
Wow.
I had gone to an English medium, they call it an English medium school. So, there's some of the classes are done in English, but I mean, definitely at that age, I don't think I understood it so as
Yeah.
well. I mean, I moved and I remember, we moved just outside of Dallas because that's where a lot of our family was. And the whole first year I had to go to English as a second language classes. And I think, and I definitely know that my parents did not intend it at all this way, but
Mm-hmm.
I think being the oldest and being the child of immigrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having never gone to school at all in the US, no one in my family had, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and then, and kind of being told that this was an opportunity where we could get better education and advance. I think where it started playing out for me was I don't remember as much in my elementary years, but definitely in my teen years. I just felt the weight of wanting to do well
Mm-hmm.
academically,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just about like me doing it. Like it was about being making my family proud. It was about being a good role model to my brother. It was, and I don't know, I felt the weight of it. So I think like for me, when I did well in school academically, right, I felt like my entire self-worth, like I felt good about myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But by the other side of it, when I didn't do as well, I just was so wrecked inside. And where the perfectionism played out was, I still remember this. I was in eighth grade. I was in algebra one. I had taken a test and had gotten into algebra one, and this was the first time that I realized you could have the letters in
Right.
math,
Right.
and so I remember I just did so bad on like the first test, and I just remember being so wrecked. And I remember those weeks afterwards where I would try to do algebra homework in our house. And the perfectionism actually manifested kind of physically. So like, I think around that stage, I now looking back, it was never diagnosed, but I definitely had some sort of like OCD type symptoms, right? So I would have to have my desk arranged in a certain way before I could do my homework.
Mm-hmm.
If I felt like something was kind of off, right, or if I was not using the pencil that I normally used to
Yep.
do my work,
Yep.
like something felt like the homework wouldn't get done as well, or I would get it
Yeah.
wrong, or.
Yeah.
And I remember a lot of anxiety around that, just wanting to do well and just perfect. And even then, I couldn't label as perfectionism,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that's what it was looking back.
Yeah. And there's so many different parts. I'm like, ooh, yes, yes. And so much that, like you said originally, that, your parents didn't intentionally try and create that, right? But sometimes as teenagers, again, with the change in the brain development and not having the full frontal part of that brain developed yet, there's the intensity, and then perceptions start to get, I'm going to say skewed, and that maybe that's not the right word, but as a teenager, we can perceive things one way, even though it's not meant that way, and
Mm,
then not go back and kind of check it out, right? So it gets
right.
internalized, like, oh, I've got to do this to please my parents. And I hear that over and over and over with the girls that I work with. And it's being able to say, your A's, B's, and C's are not about pleasing your parents. How are you doing with the class? And
Mm.
being able to reframe that a little bit.
Yeah, I know for certain I never thought of it in that way.
Yeah.
Like, in fact, as we're talking about it, like I remember my mind would always go to these extremes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it wasn't that I did bad on a quiz, right? It was that I was not going to live up to my potential, right? Like
Yes.
my mind just went to
Yeah.
the other extreme. And I never saw. I mean, it's that piece we are talking about. Like, I found a lot of my self-worth in academics, but
Mm-hmm.
I think like it really impacted me. And I just never, like, even think about it. Like, it makes me like sad. I mean, I'm grateful that I went through that season of life, but,
Mm-hmm.
I just wish someone had told me, like, it's okay,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
like you'll be okay. Like you will still have a great job and you will still
Right.
help a lot of people. Like, and I think that's part of it, right? We don't
Yeah.
know what our future is going to be like,
Right.
right? Especially as teens. I mean, I feel like teens, especially in this day and age, there's so much more pressure than
Oh,
even when I
goodness.
grew up, right?
Yeah.
And even like, everything from making sure you're doing well on your PSATs to SATs to
Mm-hmm.
picking the right college to, making sure you have enough extracurriculars. Um, it's so easy, I think, in this day and age for teens, I think, to find their self-worth
Yeah.
in all of those different things. And if one of those things does not go well, then just that their sense of self really gets wrecked, and that tendency toward wanting to, I don't know, like feeling like you're doing your best but still not good enough.
Yeah.
If that's sort of the perspective, I feel like I know that I struggled with that, and I imagine that a lot of teens do.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And as you and I were talking earlier too, I was saying, I'm listening to The Pursuit of Perfect, how to stop chasing perfectionism and start living a richer, happier life by Tal Ben Shahir, a psychologist in Harvard teaching positive psychology. And he talks in the book about how we kind of perpetuate this with our teenagers, because we tell them we want them to feel successful, and look at more at what they're doing that helps them achieve that success, not necessarily getting the A's and B's, but what are their steps, how are they planning, what's their critical thinking, how are they setting themselves up to do that. But then, as you were saying, right, the kids today, there's a lot of pressure of, I've got to get perfect grades to get into the so-called perfect college, versus our colleges also then kind of perpetuate that by saying, yeah, you have to have these best grades, versus let's look at the well-roundedness of the student, of the teen, and being able to kind of, as parents, help take that step back, or as adults, as mentors, remind the teenagers that it's not about perfection. It's how they're doing things and how they're striving just to be the best that they can be. And that is truly enough.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way that you said that because being able to hold that truth, right, is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious then, as an adult, how does it still kind of show itself, I guess? And I'm guessing also, again, kind of what Tal Ben Shahir talks about too is, we don't necessarily strive for perfectionism in all aspects of our life. I know that's true for me. There's definitely certain things when it comes to improving my home. I like go to this extreme, how it has to be perfect. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It's okay. Um, but there's definitely those aspects. And I'm curious, as an adult now, where do you see or how does that perfectionism still kind of rear up? And then what are some of the things that you're doing now to help give yourself permission to not be perfect or have some self-compassion?
Yeah. So I have the perfect example for this, but uh, Nicole, as you know, I launched a blog for my colleagues about a year and a half ago, and I remember when I was creating that blog, I was working on my About Me page. So this is that page where you tell a little bit about the blog, a little bit about you, and how the blog can, help someone that's visiting it. And I actually have not shared this ever, but I did well over 100 revisions on that About Me
Wow.
page.
Yep.
Because one was I was just putting myself out there,
Mm-hmm.
and I was so scared to put myself out there.
Yep.
And I just remember like I would spend hours on like the perfect like sort of sequence of words that
Mm-hmm.
that I thought was what needed to be on that page. And I think at some point, like, like on WordPress, right? You can tell the number of times you've saved and made the revisions or whatever.
Right.
And I was like, and it's like getting into the triple digits. And I'm like, oh my gosh. At some point, I just thought, like, I took a step back and I was like, oh my gosh, Melvin, what are you doing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not about being perfect, right?
Yeah.
Like, if anything, like this whole thing that you're doing is about actually being imperfect and saying
Yes.
that you don't know all the answers, but you're at least willing to throw some things out there that hopefully will help people and at least start a dialogue. I mean, it's still something. I'll completely be honest. It's something that I still struggle with. I fortunately haven't recently gone up to triple digits in revisions, but I think like a lot of in that context, I think it was about like word structure and all those things, but the deeper thing I think where the perfectionism was, I just wanted people to like me,
Yeah.
and I felt like maybe if I didn't have the right words or if I made a mistake on in my words that people wouldn't like me, and again, I think it's sort of where our minds can do that, right? We just think in sort of extremes, right? It's either I'm going to get this perfect, or if it's not perfect, then it's not going to be accepted.
Yeah. Instead of both and yeah, it's
Hmm.
one or the other. And I was smiling when you were saying, I was like, wow, I could totally relate to that. About, yeah, putting yourself out there. And one of my little mantras is, it's not about being perfect. It's about taking that first step. And you can
Hmm.
go back and modify it as you gain a better understanding of yourself. And so much about this is gaining insight into yourself. And the only way we can do things differently is have that awareness and then begin to change either the thoughts or the behaviors that go with it. So we do have a happier, healthier life. But you have to do that initial kind of exploring within. And there's where, again, that vulnerability can come up because we have to stop and pause and reflect.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up a good point, which I think part of embracing perfectionism is, or part of accepting perfectionism is embracing our imperfectionism,
Yeah.
and that we're human beings, right? And
Yeah.
that in certain or in all of our aspects of our life, we're not going to have it all put together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so with that website example, you know what? Sometimes I'm gonna put stuff out there. It may not resonate for anyone, and that's for everyone, and that's okay, right? And I think it's what you said. Like, I think it's also realizing that, especially something like online, right? You can put stuff out there. You can always tweak and edit later, and all of those different things. So, like a practical thing, what I do now is, if it's something like an about page, I'll set aside an increment of time. I'll say like, okay, I'm going to work on this for an hour,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all the hour time I'm going to give to myself.
Yep.
and then I'm going to move on. Not because like I can't make changes on it later, but because I just practically need to move on to other
Right.
stuff. But two, I just think like it's okay. Like I want people to see me like as me, Like I don't think the world needs to see us as like cardboard cutouts.
Right.
So
Because the reality is we're not. So,
we're not.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, you were talking about this, and it was bringing up, I've got, Brene Brown's book here, The Gifts of Imperfection. And she has the guidepost number 2 in here, which is about the perfectionism. And she talks quite often about perfectionism can also be very addictive, because when that
Mm.
mindset kicks in, like, oh, if I just look perfect, if I do this perfectly, then I will be accepted by others and nothing bad will happen. And, life will be just grand. And there again, it's shying away from, no, we're going to have ups and downs in our life. And then again, she talks about then the shame cycle can start where, we're judging ourselves, we're blaming somebody else, or we're shaming ourselves. And it becomes this vicious loop unless we kind of interrupt that cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was like, how do I also combat it?
Yeah.
I can talk definitely more because I think one thing I've done is, and I think like part of this is like my own self care skills, and I use these as sort of some ways to combat perfectionism. So like one of the things that I've started to do is I have a consistent morning routine now. I try to do this 6, if not 7 days a week, whereas I get up at the same time in the morning, and then I'm an early riser, so I usually am up by like 4:45. I'm not saying everybody needs to get up that early,
Shoo!
so but I've just noticed like I tend to be a lot more productive and just get things done, and I tend to have more clarity in my mind earlier in the day. So what I actually do is when I start my day, I don't start with work. I actually start with exercise because it puts me into the mindset of like I need to take care of my body
Mm-hmm.
if I'm going to be if I'm going to do good work in the world, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then, what I do is after some sort of 30 minutes of vigorous exercise, I usually do like P90X or something like that, where I get a little bit of variety.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, what I usually do is I listen to like a TED Talk for about 20 minutes or so. I think that kind of gets me into the right mindset. I think one of the things that I love about TED Talks is that it's people that are doing amazing things in the world, but by the same token, you can, with many of the talks, you can see the struggles they've had, right?
Yeah.
They didn't like have this overnight success,
Right.
right? And I think even though it's very subtle, I think that helps to break some of my own perfectionist tendencies that, like great things happen when you show up every day and just chip away, and no matter how awful you feel and how imperfect the product is, it's just that process of showing up every day. That's the more key thing, right?
Yeah.
And then what I usually do is some kind of a meditation routine. And then after I get done with that, that usually takes about an hour, the whole thing total,
Mm-hmm.
the exercise, the morning routine, and the TED Talks. And then at that point, I start to plan my day, and I think about, I think especially as like you know, if you're any kind of like a business owner, right? Like there's so many things you could be doing at one time. So one of the things that I do to combat perfectionism is I used to do this. I used to focus on, let me write down the 8 to 10 things that I need to accomplish today, right?
Uh-huh.
And try to go down the checklist. And then if I didn't get all of them done at the end of the day, I would just beat myself up.
Yeah.
But now what I do is I do like 1 to 3, and I say, what are essentially I followed I forgot the principle is Pareto's principle, I think
Yeah.
80/20 principle.
Yep.
So what's basically the 20% of stuff that I can do that will yield 80% of the results. And I think just taking a step back, that helps me to kind of address sort of the perfectionist tendencies, right? So it's not about like creating a beautiful, even though I love creating graphics, right? But if I'm spending 6 hours creating one graphic, that's probably not the best use of my time, right? So that's some of the stuff I do. And then, one of the other things that I've started to do recently is when I'm thinking about these tasks that I have to do for the day, I break up my days into 30-minute chunks. So the first the first 5 minutes is I think about how I want to approach that task.
Hmm.
And then the next 15 minutes is I just concentrate solely on focusing on that task.
Hmm.
And then the remaining 5 to 10, depending on whatever, sometimes I work 15, sometimes I work 20. But that remaining time I use to analyze what is that approach that I just took, was that working?
Yeah.
And if it wasn't, then I take a step back. And I think that's really helped because perfectionism, I think one of the things is, and we alluded to this, is that as soon as you dive in and you're doing a task, you can just keep doing it,
Hmm.
right? And not actually think about whether it's efficient or the best use of our time or whatever it is.
And I love it because as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, these are similar conversations I have with the teen girls regarding just kind of study habits
Mm.
and how they can get into that procrastination again, because it goes back to the perfectionism. If I can't do it, I don't understand it, I just won't do it at all. And breaking it down, very similar to what you said, into smaller chunks of looking like, how long do you think it's going to take you and what do you need before you start the task? And then pausing at the end and saying what worked, what didn't. And I love those self care skills in the beginning of the day to really get you tuned into not only your mind, but your body so that you kind of set the tone for the rest of the day. And so, for the teen girls, granted, they need their sleep. So that may not be the most, they can't exercise so much in the morning type of thing, but just even the mindfulness of the breathing, really truly eating breakfast or taking a moment just to kind of pause when they're in bed and waking up, of just tuning into themselves before they get the day going. Those are really good tips. Yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I didn't mention this, but like, even though I wake up early, I get my 8 hours of sleep because
Yeah.
I think I just realized that I used to I used to pride myself on getting less sleep and being more productive. But I think as I get older, I just realize that sleep is an opportunity for my mind and my body to rest and repair.
Correct.
And that if I get rest, then I'm going to be a lot more productive and a lot more efficient. And there's less tendency for the perfectionism to kick in.
That is absolutely true, Melvin, because when we don't get our sleep, it not only affects memory, but it really does affect mood and tolerance levels. And so most teenagers, I know, they're pretty sleep deprived on things, and a lot of the parents are as well. So that sleep is key to help kind of things be righted during the day and throughout the week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big advocate of sleep and balance and all of those things.
Yeah, sleep is good. I love sleep.
I love sleep as well.
There's times where it kind of evades me, but at the other times I'm like, oh, feels beautiful because it does. It restores the body and the brain and everything. So, yeah. Well, I'm curious here towards the end of this, how or what, I guess, kind of books or maybe other tips you would recommend to all of the male listeners that are out there, or even some of our parenting couples that are out there? Like, what would be some resources or maybe tips to kind of help them embrace themselves and then embrace each other in a more helpful or healthy way to kind of combat or begin to shift that perfectionism?
I went back and forth about what book, and I was like, "Oh, my perfectionism is kicking in. I should probably just pick a book." Um, so, the one book I really like is "Hold Me Tight: 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love." That's by Sue Johnson.
Yes.
I use that with clients, but I just think it's a wonderful book if you're in a relationship of any kind. Um, I think one thing I've learned is a lot of times conflicts in marriages and in relationships happen not because of the things that we're talking about, but really past patterns, right? And the
Hmm.
ways that we've learned to interact with the world. And this book basically goes over just seven tips, 7 conversations that every couple should be having. So like things like identifying your raw spots, which are basically the times in our lives in the past where we've been hurt by someone, right? And
Yeah.
so because that spot is still there, right? That hurt is still there. It still impacts us in the present. And so we tend to then act in certain ways. So for example, like let's say we grew up and we felt very rejected, right? And so fast forward to the present, if somewhat, if you have an argument with your significant other, it might just be an argument, right? But internally you feel like your partner no longer loves you and we react in a certain way. So like starting to identify those patterns, I feel like identifying those is such a key component of breaking them. And this book really goes into things like that.
Yeah, I love that book. I have recommended that as well to couples. And yeah, I think it's very helpful. And she's got some practical ways to work through things and tips as you were talking about. So yeah, that's great. So I'll also put this on the show notes. So if you're out and about, you can't, write all that stuff down, not a problem. It will be in the show notes. And Melvin, I'm curious, if people want to find out a little more about you or get in touch with you, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, of course. So if you're a private practitioner, you can connect with me at sellingthecouch.com. And for my private practice, which I'll be opening up very soon, I'll be working with entrepreneurs who want to make a big difference in the world, but they struggle with that perfectionism and fear and doubt. And you can find more information to that at melvinvarghese.com.
Oh, very exciting. I look forward to hearing more about that part too. That's great.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you again, Melvin, for being on and sharing again some of your vulnerabilities and struggles with perfectionism from a guy's perspective to help all of the male listeners out there today, and being able to help them embrace a little more of themselves, and maybe the other folks that are in their lives be more aware of that as well, and how we can continue to challenge the societal belief system of doing more, being more equals, you need to be perfect type of thing. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicole. I feel like this is just such an important conversation to have, and I'm grateful that we were able to have it today.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Take good care.
Thank you for listening. And if you liked today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe on iTunes or go out to my website, launchingyourdaughter.com, and sign up for my newsletter. Thank you for listening to Launching Your Daughter with Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist. For more information or to stay up to date, go to launchingyourdaughter.com. You can sign up for my email list or join my Facebook group. Thank you.